Here are some of the worst times to ever be born as a human. The Black Death. Let's start in medieval Europe, a time already not known for its comfort. Life expectancy was short, medicine was basically superstition, and then, out of nowhere, a terrifying pandemic arrived. The Black Death hit Europe in 1347 and lasted until around 1351. This wasn't just a bad flu season. This was the Bubonic Plague, and it wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population in just a few years. That's up to 200 million people globally. Imagine half of the people you know dying in under 5 years. The worst part was that nobody knew how or why it was spreading. Some people thought it was punishment from God.
Hey son, what you doing?
Just washing my hands so I won't get the flu.
I see.
Boy, get your ass back in church!
Bad air, or even that strangers were poisoning wells. But it was later discovered by French physicist Alexander Yersin in 1894 that the disease was caused by fleas on rats which were spreading a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. During this period, labor shortages shifted power structures, religious tensions exploded, and survivors lived with constant fear of the disease coming back, which it did, but in waves for centuries. If you think this is the worst time to be born, then stick around because the last one is by far the worst. The Mongol invasions. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols built the largest contiguous land empire in history. But this empire was forged through devastation. Entire cities across Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe were burned to ash. Populations that resisted were often massacred, with chronicles describing streets filled with bodies and rivers choked with the dead. Historians estimate as many as 40 million people perished as a direct result of the Mongol conquests. But it wasn't only the killing. The invasions triggered famine and economic collapse across entire regions. Farms were abandoned, trade routes were disrupted, and refugees fled from one shattered land into another. For the people living in this period, the Mongol invasions felt like the end of the world. One day your village could be thriving, and the next it could be nothing but smoke and silence. If you like this video so far, please don't forget to like this video, and if you don't, World War I. If you were a young man at this time, there was a terrifyingly high chance you'd be drafted into what people thought would be a quick war. Instead, it became one of the most nightmarish conflicts in human history. Trench warfare defying the experience. Imagine living knee-deep in mud, surrounded by rats, disease, and the stench of rotting corpses. Soldiers spent weeks and months in these endless ditches, exposed to the elements. Around 20 million people died, with tens of millions more wounded. Entire villages in France, Belgium, and across Eastern Europe vanished in the fighting, reduced to rubble by relentless artillery. Civilian populations weren't safe either. Food shortages, bombings, and displacement affected millions across Europe. Families starved as farmlands were destroyed and blockades cut off supplies. And the psychological scars ran deep. Soldiers came home with PTSD. Entire nations were left traumatized, grieving, and broken. Up next on the list of the worst times to be born is the Spanish flu. Humanity had just survived the First World War, but then something arguably worse appeared, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. Now, when you hear flu, you might think of a week in bed with soup and Netflix. Not this one. The Spanish flu was one of the deadliest pandemics ever recorded, killing at least 50 million people worldwide. Some estimates go much higher. What made it terrifying was how quickly it struck. Unlike most illnesses that target the very young or very old, this flu often killed young, healthy adults, sometimes within 48 hours of symptoms. Entire communities collapsed as doctors, nurses, and caregivers themselves became sick and died. Hospitals were overwhelmed, schools and businesses shut down, and funerals could not keep pace with the death toll. In some towns, so many died that bodies were left in homes for days, waiting for someone to bury them. Cities across the world enforced mask mandates, quarantines, and gathering bans, but fear was everywhere. Imagine being a child in 1919. Not only had you lived through a devastating war, but now every cough in your home or classroom might mean death. The Great Depression. So, say you survived World War I and the Spanish flu, you might think, finally, some stability. And for a while, in the 1920s, things actually looked good. The economy was booming, jazz was everywhere, and people thought the worst was behind them. Then, in October 1929, the stock market crashed and the world spiraled into the Great Depression. This wasn't just a bad recession. This was an economic collapse so deep that unemployment in the US hit 25%. Banks failed left and right, and millions of families lost their homes, savings, and livelihoods. If you were born in the 1930s, you likely grew up in poverty. Families struggled to feed their children. Farmers watched crops rot while people in cities starved because the economy had simply collapsed. People who had lived comfortably just years before were now destitute. The Depression wasn't just an American tragedy, it was global. In Germany, economic collapse fueled political extremism, paving the way for the rise of the Nazis. In countries like Britain, Canada, and Australia, unemployment soared and social unrest grew. Even colonies across Africa and Asia felt the impact as international trade dried up. World War II. As if one world war wasn't enough, the world plunged into another, even deadlier, just 2 decades later. World War II lasted from 1939 to 1945 and killed an estimated 70 to 85 million people, making it the deadliest conflict in human history. This war was different from the first. It wasn't just trench battles, it was global destruction. Entire cities were bombed into rubble. Civilian populations were deliberately targeted, and the Holocaust remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, with millions murdered in concentration camps. The war ended with the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a terrifying reminder of humanity's destructive potential. In total, nearly 3% of the world's population was wiped out in just 6 years. And the last on our list isn't something that affected the whole world, but China alone. And of course, that's the Great Chinese Famine. Even after the world wars ended, catastrophe wasn't over. From 1959 to 1961, China suffered the Great Chinese Famine, one of the most devastating human tragedies in modern history. It was caused by a deadly combination of poor government policies, natural disasters, and the failures of the Great Leap Forward, which was a disastrous economic and social campaign by Mao Zedong to rapidly transform China into an industrial society. Farming traditions were disrupted, steel production was prioritized over food, and unrealistic quotas left villages stripped of resources they desperately needed. The result was catastrophic. At least 15 to 30 million people died, with some estimates rising to 45 million. Whole provinces were hollowed out by hunger. Families were forced to choose who would eat and who would go without. In some regions, survival drove people to desperate, unthinkable measures. Unlike wars or invasions, this famine was not the work of foreign enemies. It was a disaster from within, a reminder that human decisions, when misguided, can be just as destructive as armies or plagues.